There are places in this world that are not merely structures of brick and wood. They are entities. They breathe. They age. And some, they watch. They never truly sleep. They never truly close their eyes. And if you're unlucky enough to cross their threshold, you might find that their gaze is fixed on you all night, every night, until you become just another part of the mosaic they observe. I'm talking about the homes that never blink. And once you've been inside, once its unblinking gaze has settled upon you, you realize it's not just watching, it's waiting. My name is Alara Vance. I'm a photographer, or I was. I needed a change, an escape from the relentless static of city life, from the echoes of a past I couldn't quite outrun. I craved silence, solitude, a blank canvas for my work and for my mind. I found it, or so I thought, in the most unlikely of places. An old house, nestled deep in the forgotten hollows of a rural landscape. The listing had been almost too good to be true. A sprawling, Victorian-era home, acreage, and a price that whispered desperation rather than market value. The real estate agent, a man named Miller, was perpetually sweating, even in the air-conditioned office. He'd cleared his throat a lot, avoided eye contact, and insisted the low price was simply because the owners wanted a quick sale. No fuss, no lingering. He called it a fixer-upper with good bones. He smiled, but his eyes were darting like a trapped bird. I remember the first time I drove up the winding, overgrown driveway. The house stood sentinel, framed by ancient, gnarled oaks, their branches like arthritic fingers reaching for a perpetually gray sky. It wasn't a charming old home, it was imposing, formidable. The windows, dark and deep-set, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Even then, a flicker of apprehension ran through me, but I dismissed it. An artist's sensibility, I told myself, a fertile ground for atmosphere. The inside was a labyrinth of shadows and dust motes dancing in the infrequent shafts of light. High ceilings, intricate crown molding, dark wood paneling, a grand decay. It smelled of old paper, damp earth, and something else, something subtle, metallic, like forgotten pennies or distant rain on hot asphalt. Miller hurried through the tour, pointing out non-existent amenities, rushing past certain rooms as if he had somewhere urgent to be. He never paused, never really looked at the house. He just looked away. "Just needs a little love," he'd stammered, handing me the keys with a haste that felt contagious. His relief when I signed the papers was almost palpable. It was as if he'd just offloaded a ticking bomb. I told myself it was just a sales tactic. Moving in was a monumental task. Every box I unpacked felt like I was disturbing a slumber. The air was thick, heavy, as if resisting my intrusions. But I pushed through, driven by my desire for this fresh start. I set up my dark room in the expansive basement, my studio space in the largest, sunniest upstairs room, or what should have been sunny. The light in this house always seemed muted, filtered, even at midday. The initial days were filled with a strange kind of peace. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the eaves or the rustle of leaves outside. It was exactly what I'd wanted. I spent hours photographing the intricate details of the house itself, the peeling wallpaper, the dust motes caught in the shafts of light, the forgotten nooks and crannies. I focused on capturing the essence of decay, the beauty in dilapidation. But then the silence began to shift. It started subtly, a creak from the floorboards upstairs when I was alone downstairs. A soft whisper of drapery, even when no window was open. The kind of noises you dismiss as an old house settling, an act of imagination, the mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar environment. I'd be in the kitchen, making tea, and I'd feel a distinct prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone or something was standing just behind me, watching. I'd whirl around, heart pounding, to find nothing, just empty space. My own reflection in the window, looking back at me with a bewildered expression. I started noticing small discrepancies. I was meticulous, almost obsessively so, with my belongings. A book I'd left open on the bedside table would be closed the next morning. A teacup I'd washed and placed on the drying rack would be in a different cabinet. Nothing overtly threatening, just out of place. My own forgetfulness, I rationalized. The stress of moving, too much solitude. But the feeling of being watched never truly dissipated. It clung to me, a persistent shadow at the edge of my perception, especially at night. Sleep became a battleground. I'd lie awake, straining my ears, convinced I could hear faint footsteps overhead or the soft rasp of breath in the next room. The house itself seemed to breathe around me, a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale. The groaning of the old timbers no longer felt random. It felt deliberate, like a sigh or a whisper. My photography began to change. I started focusing less on the decay and more on the shadows. I found myself drawn to empty doorways, to the dark corners where light struggled to penetrate. I was trying to capture the unseen, the oppressive presence that I felt permeating every inch of the house. In my developed prints, the shadows seemed deeper, more absolute. The reflections in the old glass panes of the windows often appeared distorted, almost as if something else was lurking just outside the frame. One evening, I was photographing the living room, trying to capture the way the last vestiges of twilight seeped through the tall windows. I snapped a dozen shots, moving around, experimenting with angles. Later, in the darkroom, developing the negatives, one image stopped me cold. In the upper pane of one window, where the glass was particularly old and wavy, there was a distortion. It wasn't just a blur. It looked uncannily like an eye. Not a human eye, but something larger, darker, too perfectly round and impossibly black. It was watching, directly into the room, directly at where I had been standing. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the print, my heart hammering against my ribs. Lens flare, I told myself, voice trembling. A trick of the light, an imperfection in the glass. It had to be. But the longer I looked, the more real it became. The perfect, unblinking blackness of it. I shoved the print into a box, out of sight, out of mind, but the image was seared into my brain. I tried to talk to someone. I called my friend Sarah back in the city. Her cheerful voice was like a foreign language in the heavy silence of the house. I tried to explain the feeling, the odd occurrences. She laughed gently. "Elara, honey, you're just in a giant, creepy old house all by yourself. Your imagination is running wild." But then she paused. "Hold on. What's that noise?" "What noise?" I asked, straining to hear anything other than my own ragged breathing. "It sounds like rustling, and something else, a kind of low groan. Is your landlord fixing something?" "There's no one here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Well, it's really loud on your end, E. Maybe you should check it out." I mumbled a quick goodbye and hung up. The noises she described were not there to my ears, or were they? Had the house hidden them from me, only to reveal them to an outsider? The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I decided I needed answers. Rational answers. I started researching the house, its history. There was surprisingly little information. Old property records were vague. Ownership frequently changed hands. There were whispers of a fire many decades ago, but no details. The local library had a few dusty tomes on regional history, but the section on my property was conspicuously empty. It was as if the house itself had erased its past. I ventured into the nearest small town. It was quaint, almost picture-perfect, but the eyes of the locals seemed to hold a weary knowledge. When I mentioned where I lived, their smiles tightened. A woman at the general store, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, gave me a long, assessing look. "The old Blackwood place, you mean?" she said, her voice raspy. "Used to belong to the Blackwood family, generations back. They just vanished. One day, gone. House sat empty for years after that. People tried to live there, but they never stayed long. Never do. That house, it's always been like that." "Like what?" I pressed, my heart quickening. She just shook her head, a grim set to her lips. "It watches, doesn't it? Some places just don't like being lived in. Some places, they like to keep what's theirs." She turned away, dismissing me. Her words, "it watches," resonated with a terrifying accuracy. I felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I wasn't imagining it. Other people knew. The house knew. Back in the house, the atmosphere had shifted. The subtle hints were gone. Now, the house was making its presence known. Doors I'd meticulously latched would swing open, silently, only to slam shut with a thunderous bang moments later, rattling the very foundations. The lights, which had only flickered before, now pulsed, sometimes in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, sometimes erratically, like a frantic heartbeat. The temperature in certain rooms would plummet so drastically that I could see my own breath, even in summer. I was no longer just feeling watched. I was being actively observed. I tried to catch it. I bought motion-activated cameras, placing them strategically around the house. I left audio recorders running. I was determined to gather proof, to rationalize, to understand. But the house was smarter. The cameras would inevitably malfunction. Batteries, freshly charged, would drain to nothing in minutes. Footage would be corrupted, showing only static, or worse, distorted images that seemed to writhe and shift just beyond recognition. The audio recorders captured nothing but a low hum, interspersed with my own anxious breaths. It was as if the house was actively sabotaging my attempts, protecting its secrets, refusing to be documented. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, playing tricks with the old chimneys, but then they grew clearer. My name, just barely audible, carried on an unseen current of air. Ilara, soft, almost tender, yet dripping with a possessive menace. And then other voices, familiar but twisted, distorted echoes of people I knew, people I loved, people I had lost. My mother's voice, speaking words of comfort, then dissolving into a guttural moan. My father's voice, harsh and condemning. They spoke of my past, of my failures, of the traumas I had tried so desperately to outrun. The house knew my fears. It had found my vulnerabilities. It was no longer just about feeling watched. It was about feeling known. Intimately, cruelly known. The house began to play with my perception of reality. Objects wouldn't just move, they would disappear and reappear in completely different places. My camera, which I'd left on the kitchen counter, would suddenly be on my bedside table. My journal, open on my desk, would be tucked away in a drawer. Furniture would shift, just barely. A chair I swore was angled one way would be turned slightly differently the next time I looked. The hallways seemed to stretch and narrow, the perspectives warping, making me feel disoriented, dizzy. My sense of space, of what was real and tangible, began to unravel. And the eyes, they were everywhere. The wavy patterns in the old wallpaper, the knots in the wood paneling, the dark spaces between the banisters on the staircase. They coalesced into shapes that perfectly mimicked eyes. They followed me. Every step I took, every room I entered, there they were, hundreds of unblinking gazes, fixing me in their relentless stare. Reflections became a source of terror. In the polished surface of an antique wardrobe, I would catch a glimpse of movement behind me, a shadowy form, only to turn and find nothing. My own reflection in the bathroom mirror would sometimes flicker, showing a momentary distortion, a grimace of agony, a flash of an unfamiliar face, before snapping back to my own terrified features. One night, after a particularly unsettling evening of whispers and shifting shadows, I found myself in the dust-laden drawing room. On the surface of an old mahogany table, thick with years of undisturbed grime, was a perfect, pristine handprint. It wasn't my hand. It was too large, the fingers too long, the palm impossibly wide. And beside it, traced in the dust, were two simple words. "I see you." The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. This was no longer my imagination. This was real. This was deliberate. The house was sentient, and it was playing with me, taunting me, claiming me. A primal scream built in my chest, desperate to be released, but it caught in my throat, choked by fear. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get out. My car keys. I needed my car keys. I fumbled through my bag, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grasp them. I burst out the front door, the heavy oak groaning behind me. The cool night air hit my face like a slap, but it offered no comfort. The darkness of the surrounding woods seemed to press in, a suffocating blanket. I scrambled to my car, jamming the key into the ignition. It turned. The engine sputtered once, twice, then died. I tried again. Nothing. Just a weak click. The battery was dead. Completely dead. I'd driven it just hours ago. It was impossible. Unless the house had drained it. Unless the house had found a way to tether me here. I looked back at the house. Every single window, every dark pane seemed to glow with a faint, malevolent light, like 1,000 eyes watching my desperate, futile attempt to escape. The silence that followed the car's failure was deafening. It was the silence of triumph. Panic, cold and absolute, washed over me. I tried my phone. No signal. Of course. The isolation I had craved had become my prison. The house wasn't just watching me anymore. It was feeding on my fear, on my despair, on my sanity. It began to manifest my deepest, most agonizing fears. The hallucinations became vivid, terrifyingly real. I saw my sister, lost years ago to an accident, standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale, accusing. I heard the crack of the impact, the screams, the silence. The house was projecting my trauma back at me, twisting it, amplifying it. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, the plaster swelling and contracting like skin. The intricate patterns of the wallpaper began to shift, to writhe, forming grotesque, monstrous faces that leered at me. The sounds were no longer whispers, they were screams. The screams of my sister, of my parents, of strangers, all distorted, echoing through the cavernous rooms. And sometimes, through it all, the house would whisper my name. Ilara, you belong here. You always have. I lashed out. In a fit of desperate, primal rage, I grabbed a heavy brass candelabra and swung it at one of the windows, one of the eyes that I felt was watching me most intently. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards flying. For a moment, a sliver of exhilaration, of defiance shot through me. And then the house roared. The entire structure shook violently, as if a giant hand had seized it and was rattling it like a toy. Plaster rained down from the ceiling, pictures crashed to the floor, books flew from shelves, striking me. A terrifying, guttural sound reverberated through the very foundations, a sound of immense pain or absolute fury. It was alive, and I had heard it. It retaliated. I was thrown against a wall, the impact knocking the wind out of me. As I slid to the floor, dazed, the very architecture around me seemed to warp and shift. The room began to shrink. The walls closed in, slowly, inexorably, the oppressive darkness solidifying. Shadows detached from the corners, coalescing into vaguely humanoid shapes, tall and skeletal, their forms barely visible, yet their presence absolute. I was cornered, trapped. The house was consuming me. In my terror-stricken mind, I started to see flashes, glimpses of faces, indistinct and hazy, embedded in the very fabric of the walls. A pair of wide, desperate eyes staring out from a crack in the plaster. A mouth frozen in a silent scream in the grain of the wooden floorboards. These weren't just decorative elements. They were the remnants, the previous inhabitants, the people who, like me, had been lured here, watched, and then assimilated. The house didn't just watch, it absorbed. It became its inhabitants. It consumed their consciousness, their memories, their very being, adding them to its vast, unblinking awareness. My artistic eye, my capacity for observation, my sensitivity to light and shadow, it was all being devoured, piece by piece. The house wanted to see through me, to experience through me, to make me another one of its eyes. A cold, unseen force wrapped around me, pulling me, dragging me deeper into the oppressive darkness that now seemed to emanate from every surface. My own screams became muffled, choked. I felt my sense of self dissolving, fraying at the edges, my memories blurring, mixing with others. I was no longer Ilara. I was becoming part of the house, part of its perpetual gaze. The last thing I saw, the last distinct image before the darkness claimed me entirely, was a window. The window I had tried to shatter. It was whole again, the glass smooth and unbroken, reflecting the faint, unblinking light of the moon. And in its depths, I saw not just my own terrified reflection, but something else. A profound, ancient stillness. A patience that spans centuries. The house settled. The violent shaking ceased. The whispers faded. The walls returned to their usual menacing stillness. The silence descended once more, thick and heavy, waiting. Outside, the gnarled oaks stood sentinel. The house stood, undisturbed, under the vast, indifferent sky. Its windows, dark and deep-set, glinted faintly in the moonlight. One particular pane, high up, caught the light just so, reflecting a single, impossibly dark point. A perfect, unblinking eye. It watches, it always watches, and it never blinks. And somewhere, deep within its unblinking gaze, Ilara Vance, the photographer, is still there, just another part of its vast, terrifying, all-seeing consciousness, waiting for the next one to step across the threshold.